The morning I found out, I made him breakfast. Eggs, toast, coffee, the same breakfast I had made every Saturday for 11 years. He sat at the kitchen table in his robe and read the news on his phone and thanked me without looking up, the way people thank the things they have stopped seeing. I want to tell you something about that morning that I have thought about many times since. I was standing at the counter and I could hear him behind me, the small sounds of a Saturday. The news playing quietly on his phone, the chair shifting, the ordinary texture of a life. And I was holding the spatula in my hand, and I was thinking, I have done this 800 times. 800 Saturday mornings. This exact configuration of light and sound and habit. This exact version of domestic peace. And for 800 of those mornings, it had been real to me. That is the thing about a long deception that people who have not experienced it sometimes miss. It does not feel like a lie from the inside. It feels like your life. The warmth of it is real. The routines are real. The person across the table from you is real, in every sense that matters to your daily experience. The deception does not hollow those things out while they are happening. It only hollows them out in retrospect, when you look back and try to locate the seam between what was true and what was performed, and you find that you cannot always tell the difference. I have made peace with that. But standing at that counter on that Saturday morning, I had not made peace with anything yet. I was simply breathing, carefully, deliberately, making sure that what was happening on my face matched what was supposed to be happening, which was nothing unusual. I stood at the counter with my back to him, and I breathed very carefully, because I had found the second phone the night before. It had been in the inside pocket of his coat, the gray one he only wore on Thursdays, the one he always hung in the back of the closet when he came home. I had not been looking for it. I had been looking for the pen I lent him 2 weeks ago and never got back, the one with the blue cap that I liked. I reached into that pocket, and my fingers closed around something that was not a pen. I stood in the closet for a long time before I turned it on. The passcode was our wedding anniversary. He had not even changed it. I read enough to understand what I was looking at. Then I turned it off, put it back in the coat exactly the way I found it, and I went to bed. I lay next to him in the dark, and I listened to him breathe, and I thought about the eggs I would make in the morning. And I thought, I need to know everything before I do anything. That was not the thought of a woman who was falling apart. That was the thought of a woman who had just decided something. My name is Claire. My husband's name is not important. What is important is that he had been living 2 lives for nearly 4 years, and he had done it in a way that was so practiced, so deliberate, so carefully maintained that I had not seen it. I had not seen it because he was good at it, and he was good at it because he had spent 4 years learning exactly how to manage me. Stay with me, because this is not a story about a man who cheated. There are 1,000 of those. This is a story about what I built in the 7 months after I found that phone. What I found. What I documented. What I set in motion while he sat at that kitchen table every morning, thanking me without looking up. And what happened the day I finally looked up first. Let me tell you who I was before I found that phone. Because I think it matters. I think the person you are before something like this is part of the story, not just the setup for it. I was 38 years old. I had been with my husband, I will call him Marcus, since I was 26. We had met at a work conference, not in any romantic way at first. He was presenting, I was attending. He was confident and well-organized, and he said things that sounded considered rather than performed. I was at a point in my life where I had begun to value considered over charming, and that distinction felt important. We dated for 2 years before we married. 11 years of marriage after that. No children, not by accident, but by a series of conversations we had in the early years that concluded, honestly and without resentment on either side, that neither of us wanted them. We had careers we cared about. We had a life we had built together that was, by most measures, good. I was a financial analyst. Numbers were my language. I was precise and methodical by nature and by training. I noticed patterns. I noticed anomalies. I noticed when things did not add up. I want to be honest about something. I had noticed things before I found the phone. Small things. Things I had chosen each time to explain away. Marcus traveled for work. He was in corporate consulting, which meant extended trips were normal. But beginning about 4 years before I found the phone, the trips had changed slightly. Not dramatically, just slightly. The frequency was about the same. The destinations were about the same. But the rhythm was different. He came back from trips in a way that felt like leaving, if that makes any sense. Like he was still departing, even as he walked through the door. I noticed it, and I told myself I was imagining things, that long-term partnerships shift and settle and recalibrate over time, that the comfortable distance between us was just what 11 years looked like. I noticed he had started keeping his phone face down on the table. I told myself everyone did that now. I noticed he had begun closing the bathroom door when he used to leave it open. I told myself that was just privacy, which was reasonable, which was fine. I noticed a name appearing occasionally on the credit card statements, a restaurant I did not recognize, used twice on evenings I knew he had been out. I told myself he had probably eaten with colleagues, which was not unusual, which was perfectly normal. I noticed all of these things, and I explained every single one of them away, one by one, because the alternative explanation was one I was not ready to hold. I understand now that this is what people mean when they say they did not see it coming. They saw it coming. They just made a different choice about what to do with what they saw. I want to be specific about the last thing I noticed before the phone, because I think it is the one that actually broke through. About 2 months before I found it, we were at a dinner with friends, a couple we had known for years. At some point during the evening, someone asked Marcus about a trip he had taken the month before, a consulting trip, 4 days in another city. He described it. The hotel, the client, the restaurant where they had their closing dinner. He was good at detail, Marcus. He always had been. His descriptions had the texture of truth, specific, unhurried, with the small tangential observations that make a story feel real. And I sat across from him and listened, and something in me said, I have heard this before. Not the story. The way he was telling it. The particular quality of attention he was giving to each detail, as though he was constructing rather than recalling. I had heard that quality years ago, early in our relationship, when he was occasionally evasive about things. He had gotten much better at it, but something in the rhythm was the same. I went home that night, and I thought about it for a long time. And then, I told myself, I was paranoid, that I was reading things into a perfectly normal dinner conversation, that I was, perhaps, starting to find problems where there were none, because I had been quietly dissatisfied with our marriage and needed something to name. That was the story I told myself. 2 months later, I found the phone, and I understood that I had not been paranoid. I had been right. I had been right for a long time, and I had kept talking myself out of it. The night I found the second phone, I stopped making that choice. I want to tell you what was on that phone. Not the specific messages, I will not repeat those, and I think it would not serve this story to do so. But I want to tell you the shape of what I found, because the shape of it matters. There was a woman, I will call her the other person, because she had a name and a life, and she is not the villain of this story, which I will explain in a moment. She and Marcus had been together, from what I could read, for almost exactly 4 years. The messages had the texture of an established relationship, not the breathless energy of something new, but the steady, ordinary intimacy of two people who had become part of each other's daily life. They had routines. They had private references. They had, from what I could tell, something that felt to both of them like real. I have thought about her many times. I do not know her, and I have no desire to. But I think about the version of her that existed before she learned about me, the woman who believed what she had been told, who built something on the same false foundation I had built on, who was, in the end, as deceived as I was, just differently. 2 people, in 2 apartments in the same city, each believing they understood their life. Neither of us did. And there was a child, a daughter, 22 months old in the photograph I found. A small person with Marcus's exact eyes and her mother's dark hair, sitting in a high chair with something orange on her face, looking at the camera like the world was a perfectly reasonable place to be. I stood in that closet for a long time. Then I turned off the phone, put it back in the coat, and went to bed. And I thought about eggs. I need to explain something about the 7 months that followed, because I think it is the part of this story that people find hardest to believe. I did not confront him. Not that night, not the next morning, not the week after. Not in the first month, not in the second. For 7 months, I woke up next to Marcus every morning, made coffee, went to work, came home, had dinner, and carried this knowledge inside me like a stone I had chosen to hold rather than set down. People ask, how? How do you do that? How do you look at someone every day, knowing what you know, and say nothing? And I understand the question, but I think it misunderstands what I was doing. I was not enduring. I was not surviving. I was not white-knuckling my way through each day, performing a marriage I was privately devastated by. I was working. I want to be honest about what those 7 months actually felt like, because I think when people hear a story like this, they sometimes imagine a kind of cold, efficient calm. A woman moving through her days with perfect composure and zero emotional turbulence, executing a plan. That is not what it was. There were nights during those 7 months when I could not sleep, and I lay in the dark next to Marcus, and I felt something that I can only describe as vertigo. Not physical vertigo, but the kind that comes when the ground you have been standing on reveals itself to be different from what you thought it was. When the solid thing turns out to be suspended. There were mornings when I got into my car to drive to work and I sat in the garage for 10 minutes before I could start the engine, because the weight of what I was carrying was, for those 10 minutes, more than I could arrange into motion. There were evenings when Marcus said something kind to me, something genuinely kind, not performed. The kind of thing that happens in long partnerships even when everything else is wrong, and I felt for a moment the impulse to stop all of it, to put down the file, to pretend I had not found the phone, to choose the life I could see over the truth I could not unsee. I did not do that. But I want you to know, I felt it. Because I think it is important to tell the truth about what resolve actually costs. It is not free. It is not easy. It does not feel like strength when you are inside it. It feels like holding something heavy and refusing to drop it again and again and again for 7 months. Because you have decided that the only thing worse than carrying it is what happens if you put it down too soon. I was working. From the morning after I found that phone, I had one objective: to understand the complete picture before I acted on a single piece of it. I was a financial analyst. I knew what happened when you made decisions based on incomplete information. I knew what happened when you moved before you were ready, before you had all the data, before you could see the full shape of what you were dealing with. Marcus had been running a deception for 4 years. He had been careful and deliberate and practiced. If I confronted him with a second phone and fragments of messages, he would have an explanation. He always had explanations. That was part of who he was, the considered, well-organized man who said things that sounded reasonable. He would explain, and I would either believe the explanation or I would not. But either way, I would have shown him what I knew, and I would have lost the element that was the only real advantage I had. He did not know that I knew. That was everything. So I kept my mouth shut, and I started building a file. The first thing I did was photograph every message on that second phone. All of it. 4 years of messages, in batches, over 3 separate Thursday evenings when I knew Marcus would be out late. I borrowed the phone from the coat pocket, photographed each screen in sequence, returned it exactly as I had found it. It took me 11 hours total across those 3 evenings. When I was done, I had over 800 photographs stored on a cloud account Marcus had no access to and did not know existed. The second thing I did was hire a private investigator. I want to be clear about why I did this. Not because I needed confirmation of the affair I had that, but because I needed to understand the financial picture. Here's what I knew about our finances. Marcus and I had joint accounts for household expenses and separate accounts for our individual savings and investments. We had agreed on this structure early in our marriage and had never changed it. What I had never done in 11 years was look closely at Marcus's separate accounts. We had always operated on trust in that regard. I handled our joint expenses. He handled his portion of the contributions. Everything worked. What I did not know was what Marcus had been funding from those separate accounts for 4 years. Let me tell you something about hiring a private investigator that I had not expected. I had imagined it as something clandestine, something that would feel like a transgression, like crossing a line I was not supposed to cross. I had some version of this in my head from film and television, a shadowy figure, photographs slid across a table, the uncomfortable intimacy of surveillance. What it actually felt like was professional, almost mundane. My investigator was a woman in her 50s who had run her own firm for 15 years. She wore sensible shoes and took precise notes and asked questions in the specific, neutral way of someone who has heard everything before and reacted to none of it. She told me at our first meeting that her job was to find what was there to be found and document it in a way that would hold up. Not to take sides, not to make judgments, not to tell me how I should feel about the results. She said, "Do you want me to find the child?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you prepared for what that documentation might include?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Then let us get started." My investigator spent 6 weeks on the financial piece. What she found was this. Marcus had been supporting a separate household for almost the entire duration of the relationship. Rent on an apartment across the city, a 2-bedroom, 3rd floor, lease signed in his name, renewed twice. Regular transfers that covered groceries, utilities, childcare, a savings account he had opened in his daughter's name 18 months after she was born. Funded on the 1st of every month without exception. I remember the moment I read that last detail. The 1st of every month. The same date I paid our mortgage. The same quiet, automatic reliability of a man who honored his commitments. Both of them. None of this was illegal. A man is not prohibited from spending his own money how he chooses. But it told me something important about the conversation we were eventually going to have. It told me Marcus had made financial commitments that had been running parallel to our marriage for years. It told me those commitments were ongoing. And it told me that when the time came to discuss the dissolution of our life together, I needed to understand every single asset and liability before I sat across from him. So I hired a second professional, a divorce attorney. I want to say something about that choice, because people sometimes react to it with surprise. You hired a divorce attorney before you had even spoken to your husband about what you knew? Yes, because I had spent 11 years being the person who reacted, who accommodated, who explained things away. I had spent 4 years not seeing something that was right in front of me. And I had spent 7 months watching Marcus sit at my kitchen table and thank me without looking up while he maintained 2 lives simultaneously. I was not going to walk into the most important conversation of my life unprepared. My attorney spent a month reviewing our financial situation. The joint assets. The property. The retirement accounts. The business Marcus had started 3 years ago, which I had contributed to in the early stages and which had grown significantly. Every piece of the financial life we had built, documented and valued and understood. I also, during this period, did something that felt small at the time and turned out to matter enormously. I called Marcus's assistant. Not to ask about Marcus, I would never have done that. But Marcus's assistant had worked with him for 6 years, and she was, as far as I knew, loyal to him completely. What I did not know until I called, with the pretext of confirming a dinner reservation I said I was trying to reschedule, was that she had quit 3 weeks before. She had given 2 weeks' notice and left. When I asked the person who answered why she had left, there was a pause, and then she found a better opportunity. I made a note of that and moved on. 3 weeks later, through a professional contact, I found her new workplace and sent her a letter. Not asking her to do anything, just telling her, simply and briefly, who I was and what I had found, and that I was in the process of understanding the full picture before I took any action, and that if there was anything she wanted me to know, she could reach me at a number I included. She called me 4 days later. What she told me was this. In the 6 years she had worked for Marcus, she had known about the second relationship for most of them. She had been asked, at various points, to cover for him, to confirm alibi schedules, to book travel under descriptions that did not match the actual destinations. She had done these things because she needed the job, and because Marcus had been a good employer in every other respect, and because she had told herself it was not her business. Before she told me that, she told me something else. She told me what it had been like, in those 6 years, to know what she knew. She said it had started small. A request here, a cover there, the kind of thing that a person in her position could rationalize because it was not illegal, and because the man asking was otherwise, as she said, genuinely decent in the ways that made up most of your day. He thanked people. He remembered things. He advocated for his team. He was, in the vocabulary of the workplace, a good boss. She said, I used to think that the good parts balanced the rest, that nobody is entirely one thing, and that what I was being asked to do was a private matter between a man and his family, which was not my business to adjudicate. She said, I stopped thinking that eventually, but it took longer than I would like to admit. I asked her what changed. She said, I watched what happened to people around him who got in the way of something he wanted. not badly, not dramatically. He would not do something dramatic, but quietly. The quiet removal of support. A recommendation that did not come. A credit that went to someone else, she said. I started to see it as a pattern, not cruelty for its own sake, just management. Everything managed, everything kept in its proper lane. She said. And then he asked me to do something I was not willing to do. She had left because Marcus had asked her to do something she was not willing to do. He had asked her to help him arrange a document. A financial document, related, she believed, to the other household. She did not know exactly what the document was, but she knew it was something she did not want her name near. I thanked her. I asked if she would be willing to provide a written account of what she had told me. She said she would think about it. 2 weeks later, she sent me a detailed statement by email. I added it to the file. By month 5, the file was substantial. Financial records, photographs of the phone messages, the investigator's report, the attorney's asset analysis, the assistant's statement, a timeline I had built myself, working backward from what I knew, mapping 4 years of deception against 4 years of my own memories, the trips, the distance, the explanations, the small things I had noticed and chosen not to pursue. Looking at that timeline was one of the harder things I did during those 7 months, not because of what Marcus had done. I had made a certain peace with that, or at least a functional one, somewhere in the 3rd month. What the timeline showed me was something about myself that I found more difficult to sit with. How carefully I had participated in not knowing. How many times I had handed myself an explanation and accepted it because the alternative required more of me than I was ready to give. I had been, for 4 years, a very good analyst who had looked away from the one dataset that mattered most. I do not say this with self-blame. I say it with something that I think is more accurate than blame. Understanding. I had not been careless or stupid. I had been a person who loved her life and did not want it to be what it was turning out to be. That is not a character flaw. That is just being human. But I had spent 7 months not looking away. And by month 6, I knew everything I needed to know. I want to tell you about the last week before the conversation, because I think it is part of the story. By that point, I had been carrying the full weight of the file for weeks. Every document was in order. My attorney had reviewed everything. The timeline was complete. There was nothing left to find, and nothing left to prepare. I just had to choose the moment. That week, Marcus and I went to dinner with neighbors on a Thursday. We came home, and he made tea, and we talked about something inconsequential, a project at his work. Something a friend had said, and I sat across from him in the kitchen, and I thought, this is the last Thursday. This is the last version of this. After Sunday, none of this will look the same. I do not know exactly what I felt in that moment. Something that was not quite grief and not quite relief. Something that lived in the narrow space between the end of one thing and the beginning of whatever came after it. On Saturday morning, I made his breakfast one last time. Eggs, toast, coffee. He thanked me, without looking up. On Sunday evening, I set the folder on the kitchen table, and I walked into the living room, and I said, I need to talk to you about something. Let me tell you about the conversation. It was a Sunday evening in November. We had had dinner I had cooked, as I usually did on Sundays. Marcus had done the dishes, as he usually did, the small domestic choreography of a marriage that looked, from the outside, completely normal. We were sitting in the living room. He was reading. I had a glass of wine. I said, I need to talk to you about something. He looked up from his book, and I want to tell you about his expression in that moment, because I had thought about it for 7 months. I had wondered what he would look like when this conversation finally started, whether I would see guilt there, or fear, or something that looked like relief. What I saw was patience, that practiced, managed patience of a man who was accustomed to handling things, who had been handling things for a long time, who had, I realized in that moment, probably had this conversation before in his head, who had prepared for it the way I had prepared for it, just from a different position. He set down his book. I put my wine glass on the table, and I placed a single photograph on the cushion between us. It was a photograph from his phone, the one of his daughter in the high chair with the orange on her face. He looked at it for a long time. He said, How long have you known? I said, 7 months. His expression did not change exactly, but something behind his eyes shifted, the kind of shift that happens when a person recalibrates, when the understanding of a situation changes faster than the face can follow. He said, "I want to explain." I said, "I know you do. And I want you to know that before we have that conversation, there is a folder on the kitchen table that you should probably look at. Take whatever time you need. I will be here when you are ready." He went to the kitchen. He was in there for 45 minutes. I want to tell you what I did during those 45 minutes. I sat in the living room, and I did not move. I had a glass of wine on the table in front of me, and I did not touch it. I could hear, occasionally, the sound of pages turning in the kitchen. A chair, a long silence, what might have been, toward the end, something that sounded like a man sitting very still with the weight of a document in his hands. I had imagined this moment many times over 7 months. I had imagined it the way you imagine the final scene of something you have been building toward, not with anticipation, exactly, but with the kind of focused waiting that is its own specific form of exhaustion. I had wondered if I would feel satisfaction when it came. I had wondered if there would be some release, some sense of completion, when the 7 months of silence finally became the conversation. What I actually felt, sitting in that living room, was very quiet. Not numb, not empty, just quiet. In the way a room is quiet after a sound has finally stopped. As if something that had been held at a low constant tension for a very long time had simply, gradually, let go. I thought about the woman who had photographed 800 phone screens over 11 hours. I thought about the version of myself who had sat in the garage, unable to start the engine. I thought about every Saturday morning I had made eggs and breathed carefully and said nothing because I had decided once that I needed to know everything before I did anything. 7 months. And now the knowing was in that kitchen, face up on a table, in a folder I had built one document at a time. I was ready for whatever came next. When he came back, he sat down across from me, and he was a different version of himself than the one who had gone in. The management was gone. The patience was gone. What was there instead was just a man sitting in the consequence of 4 years of choices, looking at someone who had spent 7 months making sure he could not reduce any of it to less than what it was. He said, "You documented all of this." I said, "Every piece." He said, "The finances too." I said, "Every account. Every transfer. Every asset." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "The attorney." I said, "Yes." He said, "How long have you been planning this?" I said, "Since the morning after I found the phone, 7 months ago, while I was making your breakfast." The room was very quiet. Then he said something I had not expected. He said, "I am sorry. Not for your sake, I know that does not help you, and I know you do not need it from me right now. I am sorry because I am sitting here looking at what I did, and I cannot make it something smaller than it is. I want to be honest about what that was like to hear. It did not undo anything. It did not close any wound. But it was the truest thing he had said to me in 4 years, and I received it for what it was. A man, finally, telling the truth. Not to manage me, or to negotiate, or to reduce the damage. Just the truth, stated plainly, with nowhere left to hide. I said, "I know. And that is why we are going to handle this the way we are going to handle it." The divorce took 8 months. I will not walk through every detail of those 8 months, because the legal and financial process, while important, is not the story. The story is what was at the center of it and how we navigated that center. The other person the woman Marcus had been with for 4 years was not my enemy. I want to be very clear about this. She had not known about me for most of the relationship. She had discovered the existence of our marriage approximately 14 months before the night I put that photograph on the cushion. She had, at that point, confronted Marcus, believed his explanation that the marriage was effectively over, and continued the relationship on the basis of that information. She had been lied to as well, just differently. I am not going to tell you I felt warmth toward her. I did not at first. What I felt toward her was something more complicated and more honest. I felt the recognition of a person who had also built something real on a foundation that someone else had deliberately falsified. We never spoke directly. There was no reason to. But in the legal process, when it came to questions about the child, about support, about the financial commitments Marcus had made to that household, I did not position myself as an obstacle. The child was not responsible for any of this. The arrangement that was eventually made was fair, not because I was a saint, because I had spent 7 months building something that left no room for pettiness, and I was not going to compromise that by becoming smaller at the end. Marcus received a settlement that was, by the assessment of everyone involved, significantly less than what he would have received had he initiated the divorce rather than responding to one built on documented evidence of financial concealment. The business I had contributed to in its early stages was valued properly, and my contribution was compensated properly. The retirement accounts were divided correctly. The property was handled without dispute because there was nothing left to dispute. He did not fight any of it. I think he understood, by that point, that fighting was not a position available to him, that I had spent 7 months making sure of exactly that. I want to tell you one more thing about those 8 months, because I think it belongs in this story. There was a point, about 3 months into the divorce proceedings, when Marcus's attorney made a move that I had not anticipated. Not a legal maneuver, something quieter than that. Marcus asked, through his attorney, if I would be willing to have a single conversation outside the formal process. Not a negotiation. Not a settlement discussion. Just a conversation. I asked my attorney what she thought. She said, "It is your call. There is nothing to be gained from it legally. But if you think there is something you need from it personally, that is a different question." I thought about it for 2 days. Then I said yes. We met at a coffee shop near our old neighborhood. He was there before I arrived. He looked different than he had on the night I put the photograph on the cushion, tired in a new way. The kind of tired that accumulates when the thing you have been managing finally stops being manageable. He said, "I did not ask for this conversation to change anything. I know nothing changes." I said, "Then why did you ask?" He said, "Because I want to understand something." He paused. He said, "When did you decide to do it this way?" "The 7 months. The file. All of it." I said, "The morning after I found the phone." He said, "Were you angry?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You did not act like it." I said, "I know." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "That must have cost you something." I said, "Yes, it did." He nodded. He said nothing else about it. We talked for 20 minutes about practical things, the house, some items that had been left in the garage, a minor financial question his attorney had neglected to close out. Then we left. I have not spoken to him since. But I think about that question sometimes. Were you angry? And the answer I gave him, which was yes, is true. I was angry. I was angry for a long time and in many different ways, and that anger was legitimate and real, and I do not think there was anything wrong with having it. What I chose to do with it, that was the part I was in control of. The day the divorce was finalized, I drove to a park near our old house, my house, now, and I sat in the car for a long time. I want to tell you what I felt, because I think people expect a particular answer to that question, and the real answer is more complicated. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel free, not in the way the word implies a sudden opening. I felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The kind of tired that comes from carrying something carefully for a very long time and finally setting it down. And underneath the tired, something else. Something quieter and harder to name. I think it was grief, real grief, for the marriage I had believed in, for the man I had thought I knew, for the 11 years of ordinary Saturdays and kitchen conversations and shared routines that had been real to me even when they had been, for him, one half of something I did not know about. I grieved all of that. And then I started over. I want to stay on that phrase for a moment, because I think it is the most important thing I have said. I started over, not from zero. I want to be clear about that. Starting over does not mean erasing. It does not mean pretending the 11 years did not exist, or that what happened in them did not shape who I became, or that the grief of it is not real and ongoing in ways I still navigate. Starting over means choosing, deliberately, what you carry forward and what you set down. I carried forward the person I had become during those 7 months, the one who built something careful and complete before she acted, The one who did not let hurt make her reckless. The one who understood that the most powerful position is not the most emotional one, but the most prepared one. I set down the habit of explaining things away. That, more than anything else, is the practical legacy of what happened to me. Not the divorce settlement, not the professional recalibration, not even the particular satisfaction of sitting across from a man who had spent 4 years managing me and watching the management finally, completely, run out of room. It is this. I stopped being a person who looked away from the data when it was inconvenient. I became, instead, the kind of person who looks directly at what is in front of her, who trusts what she sees even when what she sees requires something difficult of her, who understands that clarity, however hard it is to arrive at, is always worth more than the comfortable alternative. That is the skill I built during those 7 months. And it has changed, in ways both large and small, every significant decision I have made since. Now, I told you to stay with me, because there was a twist. And there is. About 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I received a letter. It was from a woman I had never heard of. Her name meant nothing to me. She had found me, she explained, through a professional network we had in common, and she wanted to speak with me about something she described only as a matter of professional concern related to Marcus. I almost did not call her back. I was tired. I was done. I had no interest in re-entering anything that had Marcus's name on it. But I called her back. She had worked, several years ago, at the consulting firm where Marcus had made his reputation before going independent. She had worked there during the period when Marcus was building his career, when his name was becoming known in the industry, when he was winning accounts and climbing and establishing himself as someone to watch. She said, "I think you should know that the account that made his career was not entirely his." She said, he had a partner on that account, a junior partner, a woman who had done most of the analytical work. And when the account landed and the credit was distributed, Marcus received the credit and his partner received a performance review that cited inadequate contribution and ended with a quiet departure. She said, I was the junior partner. I sat with that for a long time. I sat with this information for a long time before I decided what to do with it. The honest answer is that I did not do anything with it in any active sense. There was no legal avenue. The situation she described was years old, professionally ambiguous, and involved a workplace dynamic that I had no standing in. It was not something I could add to my file in any meaningful way, but it did something to my understanding of Marcus that I think is worth naming. I had spent 7 months and then 8 more months of divorce thinking of what happened between us as a particular kind of betrayal. The specific kind, a husband, a second relationship, a secret family. The story that exists in a category. What the assistant told me complicated that. Because what she described was not a different act, it was the same act, expressed in a different context. The same practiced management of other people's reality. The same willingness to take what you want from a situation and adjust the surrounding narrative to accommodate it. The same fundamental confidence that you can maintain 2 different versions of yourself in 2 different rooms, and that the rooms will never intersect. It was not a man who had made a mistake. It was a man who had learned, somewhere along the way, that people are manageable, that their perceptions can be shaped, that if you are careful and consistent and you give people enough of what they need, they will tend not to look at what you are not showing them. I had been right about that. Back in those 7 months, without knowing I was right. I had built something so complete, not just because I was methodical by nature, but because some part of me had understood that I was dealing with something practiced. I want to be careful about what I say here, because I only have her account, and her account is one side of a complex professional situation from years ago, and I am not in a position to determine the full truth of it. What I can tell you is this. She was not asking for anything. She was not threatening anything. She was simply telling me something she had carried for a long time, and she had decided, after reading about the divorce in a professional network bulletin, that she wanted someone who had known Marcus to know it. She said, I do not know if it matters to you, but I wanted someone to know. I said, it matters. And I thought about something. I thought about the night I found the second phone and the choice I made to not act immediately, to build the picture first, to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with before I moved a single inch. I had made that choice because of who I was, an analyst, a person who understood that incomplete information produces incomplete decisions. But I had also made that choice because something in me, the part that had spent 4 years noticing and explaining away, had understood that Marcus was not the kind of person whose deceits were isolated events. They were patterns. They were a way of operating. And patterns, if you are patient enough, always show you more than the first instance. I had been right. I had just not known yet how right. Today, my life is mine in a way it has never quite been before. I live in the same house. I kept the house, which had been my choice and my investment from the beginning, and which now feels, for the first time, like exactly what it always was. A place that belongs to me. I changed jobs, not because I had to. My position was fine, unaffected, but because I had spent so much of the past several years in a particular relationship to my own work, viewing it as the stable thing, the reliable thing, the part of my life that was unambiguously mine, and I wanted to see what it felt like to choose something rather than hold on to it. I chose something that scared me a little. A smaller firm, a more demanding role, work that required more of me than the comfortable position I had occupied for years. It turned out I was capable of more than comfortable. That was probably not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. Here is what I want you to take from this. I spent 4 years not looking at what was right in front of me. I have thought about those 4 years many times, from many angles, and I have come to understand them this way. I was not naive. I was not weak. I was a person who had made a significant investment in a life and who was not ready for a long time to accept that the investment had been made on false terms. There is nothing shameful in that. It is one of the most human things there is. But the moment I picked up that second phone, the moment I saw what was on it and made the choice to understand before I acted, something shifted. Not from victim to victor. I dislike those words, and I think they flatten something that is actually more complicated and more interesting. What shifted was this. I stopped making decisions based on what I hoped was true and started making decisions based on what I could prove was true. And it turned out that those two things were very different. I want to say one more thing before I close this story, because I think it is the truest thing I know about what I went through. People sometimes describe what I did as revenge. I understand why. The word has a certain accuracy to it, in the limited sense that I built something specifically designed to ensure a particular outcome for a particular person. But I do not think that is the right word for what actually happened. Revenge is about making someone feel what you felt. It is about the transfer of pain, the balancing of a specific injury with a specific injury in return. What I built was not that. What I built was a position. A position that was so thorough, so documented, so completely assembled, that when the conversation finally happened, there was nothing left to negotiate. Not because I wanted to wound him, though I will not pretend I was indifferent to his discomfort, but because I had spent 4 years in a version of reality that someone else had constructed, and I needed the conversation that ended it to happen in a version of reality that I had constructed. I needed, once, to be the one who had built the room. That is different from revenge. That is closer to reclamation. Taking back the thing that had been taken from you, which was not the marriage, and was not the money, and was not even the years. It was the sense that you were the person in your own life who was paying the most attention, that your read of the situation could be trusted, that what you saw was what was there. I got that back. If you are in a life where the story you are being told does not match the one you can see with your own eyes, trust your eyes. Not immediately, not impulsively, but do not explain it away indefinitely. At some point, what you notice becomes what you know, and what you know is the only foundation on which anything real can be built. The most powerful position you can be in is not the one where you have the most anger or the most hurt or the most right to be outraged. It is the one where you have already done the work, where you have built something so complete that there is nothing left to argue about, where you walk into the room already knowing the outcome because you spent the months before it making sure. If this story reached you, if any part of it felt familiar or true or like something you needed to hear, subscribe to this channel. Every week, one story. About the person who was counted out, about the person who stayed quiet, about the person who did the work before anyone else knew the work was being done, and then showed up. You are not alone in this, and you are not finished yet. We will see you next time.